Good morning, Kentucky. It is 9 a.m. and welcome to our first virtual local food systems summit. This is our third annual summit. 3 years ago, Dr. Potter Wright, who is to my left on the Zoom, and I threw together a summit with our great partners at Bluegrass Tomorrow. We've brought Kentucky Department of Agriculture in as our partner now. We've got KCARD, Kentucky Center for Agriculture and Rural Development, and the Kentucky Horticultural Council, and our partners today, the College of Agriculture, as always. So delighted to have you. Wish we could be in person. So I'm going to stop the share on our pre-summit slides. So I think you just see me. We are in a Zoom webinar. So many of us have spent the past year on Zoom, but I will just let you know that the difference here is you only see and we only see the folks who are panelists. So the main ways that you will interact with us today during our summit is through the chat. So I'm going to say hello in the chat here. And this is the space for you all to communicate with each other, share ideas, have your side conversations with the other attendees. This is a place to network and share the projects that you've been working on in your communities. And then there's a separate piece called Q&A. So if you're looking at your Zoom screen, down at the bottom here, there's a difference between chat and question and answer. Question and answer is what we'll use today for you to ask questions of our panelists. So you might have a clarifying question, say like, can someone please say the name of that again? Or when we get to the Q&A sections of each of our keynote and our panel discussions today, we will look only to the question and answer chat boxes to have those questions that our moderators will then pose to the panelists. So if someone wants to practice, you can go ahead and you want to see the difference between them. You want to ask me what I had for breakfast today. If you put it in the chat, I won't answer. If you put it in the Q&A, I will. So that's the quick rundown there. So you don't need to worry about having your video on or off or muted or won't muted. You are totally fine on your side of this summit today. So we miss seeing your faces, but it's the best way to manage it. So we have 250 people registered for today's summit, which is as many as we had in person last year, which is remarkable. And we're so grateful that after a year of Zoom, you want to spend a half day on Zoom with us. But I think it speaks to the strength of our, tell us about breakfast. Kristen, I'm so glad. I had a lovely, I had some Greek yogurt with some non-seasonal fresh berries in it because I need a little treat and some pecans. So thank you. I'm going to type it here, yogurt and fruit. And then you'll see, now it's in the answered questions and you can see the answers. So we've got a great, archive there. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Lillian Brislin. I'm the director of the Food Connection at the University of Kentucky. If this is your first time meeting me, we are a local food systems center. We work really closely with our on-campus dining to bring Kentucky raised and produced foods into our dining halls. We do culinary education. We do on-farm technical assistance if you've ever met our agent, Brian Brady. So lots of fun things, and we're honored to host it. I will invite Dr. Potter Wright because she's here to introduce herself as one of our co-hosts.
Hey everybody, good morning. Thanks, Lillian. I'm Ashton Potter Wright, Director of Local Food and Agricultural Development for the City of Lexington, and I manage the Bluegrass Farm to Table program. I'm honored to be here co-presenting again with Dr. Brislin and our other partners at KCARD and Kentucky Proud and the Kentucky Horticultural Council. We're so grateful. Thanks, Lily.
Thanks, you all. And we've got a great schedule today. So it's posted on the website, but I'll let you know. We have our keynote with Mary Shelman. We're going to look at what does resilience look like for our local food systems. We have our panel at 10 o'clock on pandemic pivots on the farm, looking at how our farmers have innovated, adapted, adjusted, recovered, and found resilience throughout this pandemic. Session 2 is scaling up and over. So looking at that agriculture of the middle, those sort of mid-tier value chains around animals, livestock, dairy products. And we've got a great guest here from the Rye Project looking at some row crops, so some new spaces in local food systems. And then our final panel of the day will be crisis care and recovery, listening to some of the great community organizations that have done the work of making sure that our communities stay healthy and fed with support from our local food producers during the pandemic. And then we'll have some brief closing remarks. So that is the plan for today. I'll welcome you all in the chat. If you want to share, just say hello, say where you're coming from or what part of the food system you're from. We'd love to know who's out there. So Chelsea and Debbie have said hi, so please feel free to use that. And I will turn it over to Ashton to introduce our keynote speaker and get this first session started.
Perfect. Thanks, Lily. So today I'm honored to introduce Mary Shelman as our keynote speaker to kick off this year's summit. I was just looking and reflecting upon the first time I had the pleasure of meeting Mary, which was exactly 1 year ago today, March 3rd, 2020, when she came to Kentucky to help Dean Cox, Mayor Gorton, Commissioner Quarles, and Dr. Mark Lyons at Alltech help conduct and kick off really the study examining and developing a strategy for food and ag tech development here in the Lexington Bluegrass region. And so we kicked off that project 1 year ago today, and it's hard to believe what a year it's been, Mary. So I'd love to share a little bit, for those of you who don't know Mary, I want to share a little bit about her background and why she was so well positioned for this work and why we're so excited to have her here today. So Mary is an internationally recognized thought leader, author, and speaker on global agribusiness, ag tech, and food systems trends. She's the former director of Harvard Business School's agribusiness program. She now works with companies, governments, and investors around the world. She draws upon decades of experience in industry and academia to provide unique insights into technology, sustainability, and consumer trends. She champions collaboration, industry alignment, and strategic planning to achieve system-wide improvements and create pathways for sustainable growth. She's a native Kentuckian. She's from Elizabethtown, where she still owns a family farm. Mary also holds a BS in chemical engineering with high distinction from the University of Kentucky and an MBA with distinction from Harvard Business School. She's a member of the executive committee of the Kentucky Council on Agricultural Research, Extension, and Teaching, and she's currently president-elect of UK's National Alumni Association. So welcome, Mary. We're so grateful to have you here today.
Thank you, Ashton. It's a pleasure to be here. It's also just mind-boggling to think that it was exactly a year ago today that we met out at the barn and kicked off what I think was a really interesting project. But who could have imagined how much things would change? I remember we had conversations about, should you take your trip to New Orleans that was coming up the next week, and we kind of went back and forth on it. And so anyway, I'm just delighted to be here and so kick off this very important, Kentucky Local Food System Summit. As all of you heard, Kentucky's really near and dear to my heart. I grew up there. My dad was a farm equipment dealer, a farmer, and I still have a house and farm, which I look forward to visiting again really soon. So I'm really sorry we're not together in person, and I look forward to that time when we can get back together and we can share, stories and ideas over a cup of coffee or a bourbon. But until then, we're really, fortunate that we figured out that technology can allow us to come together in a way that we couldn't have imagined last year. I'm going to try to share my screen here, and we're going to see how this works. Hopefully everything will be fine. Let me know if you can't see it, but hopefully you can. But it's great.
Looks good.
So anyway, just to think about it again, it's just hard to believe how much things have changed over the last year. Entire industries are transforming around us, as Ashton described, as I've said, I've spent almost 6 decades in this industry now, kind of living it as, going with my dad as he was out selling farm equipment and also kind of working in the dealership. I'm studying it at Harvard Business School for a number of years as director of the agribusiness program there. And now today, I work with interesting companies and governments around the world. And it's just the pace of change in the agriculture and food industry is just faster than ever before. So I've been asked today to speak to you about Kentucky's future and how a resilient local food system can play an important role. And this is, again, a subject that's near and dear to me. I have so much I want to share with you. And I apologize in advance for talking too fast. So my plan for the next 20 minutes, I always start kind of top down, a brief, review of the global trends that are driving change and creating new opportunities for sustainable food, for feed and fiber, all across the food system. I want to share a part of the project on ag tech that Ashton was talking about, and in particular how it relates to local food systems. And then I want to end up with some thoughts on my mind about the importance of local food systems and resiliency, and thinking about some questions that are also on my mind about how we can move forward, and some recommendations for Kentucky. And then we're going to take that conversation forward. So you just don't hear from me, but we're going to move into the format of a fireside chat between myself, kind of with this more of a global view, and with Lillian, and with Alita Pot, and really think about it from the Kentucky view and kind of push into some of these issues. So let's begin with these 4 trends. And again, I apologize for running through these very fast, but I just always want to get everybody off with these 4 big things that are going on in the world from a very high level perspective. And I know you all know these, but I think sometimes it's helpful to see them all together. The first one is the fact that consumers today have more control, more impact on our food system than ever before. They're placing higher requirements on food producers, on asking questions about how food is produced. A big part of the drivers here are these millennials that are, asking, changing in terms of what, where, and how they buy food. They're, in a very good way, recognize a much greater link between what they eat and their personal health and wellness. And they're also leading the way on values-based decisions. They care about things like climate change, the environment, animal welfare, and product origins. So, they want food that's fresh. They want food that's local, that's sustainable, healthy, convenient at the same time. And looking at these as additional attributes and willing to pay more for them, much as opposed to thinking just about kind of, what's the cost of the product, and, maybe what are those nutritional components on the side of the box. Related to this is the fact that over the last 10 years that sustainability has grown from a marketing tool, basically, saying that a product is green, to a fundamental requirement of doing business. And this is true all the way across, industries, and certainly across the agri-food chain. In the agri-food industry, sustainability is evolved from, I'm doing this because I'm protecting my reputation, to now I have to think seriously about sustainability because I need to make sure there's supply in the future. I need to win customers based on sustainability, to satisfy consumers. And I also need to access the capital markets to get either loans or, operating capital investments to fund my business. And, probably the most important piece of this to me, and I think that we're seeing some really critical aspects around it, is to ensure the industry.
Mary, you may have frozen a bit.
Well, we'll get her back on here. Looks like she's having some internet issues. So I've noticed some folks are putting questions in the, oh, great, Sandy moved to Dozer. How do we know consumers will pay more for this fresh, local, sustainable, healthy, convenient, and where is that data? So I think there have been some national studies, now Ashton's featured, that are looking at willingness to pay. Here comes Mary.
Oh, here, sorry about that.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Where did you lose me?
I'm not sure, but you had some great slides up when we were talking about consumers' interest in paying for the qualities of their food.
Okay, great. So let's go back one slide, and I'll talk about sustainability. again, which is actually related to this, and how sustainability today has become fundamental in many industries, but particularly in the food system. And it's gone from something about just my product is green to being a basic tenet of doing business. It's important because consumers expect it. It's about securing supply for the future. Employees really engage with companies that have a purpose behind it. And it's also about accessing capital. And because of this, companies really are making commitments and spending in terms of carbon, in terms of water, biodiversity. And what we know in food is that sustainability of an agricultural product begins on the farm. You can't make something more sustainable once it gets past the farm gate. This is supporting greater linkages and collaboration all across the supply chain in order to drive improvements at the farm level. And we see a lot of creative programs underway to increase the adoption of regenerative agriculture, carbon sequestration, biodiversity issues, and data is really the cornerstone of these initiatives. The third trend that is particularly exciting is about the transformational power of technologies that are being developed today. These are impacting every level of supply chain, from the genetics of crops, automation, big data, new ways that we purchase products, and the ability to differentiate products themselves. One exciting piece of this to me, there's so many things we could talk about, and I'll come back to tech in a little bit, is the ability of technology to connect farm and fork. This is one interesting example is Driscoll's use of a barcode on the bottom of every package of berries they sell, and this barcode takes you back to the specific field where that product was picked in the specific even picker day and time that it was picked. And Driscoll's invites consumers, shoppers, that to go online to fill out a questionnaire based on this one particular package they have about the quality of those products and the use of those products, and gets enough real-time information that they can actually make changes in the field and say, hey, wait a minute, berries coming out of this field maybe are not as good quality. So the idea about that, this gives us a two-way information flow. I mean, often we see technology giving us one-way information, but how you get this two-way information flow is actually revolutionary in the food and ag space. The fourth trend, and this is one you might not think about as often, is the amount of capital that's coming into agriculture today. The level and type of outside investment has substantially increased. I mean, it's been at a record. It was even more at a record last year. Investors see significant opportunity in this space for disruption and for above market returns. And it's not only the level of investment, but the type of investor has changed. Historically, agriculture, I think in food as well, has appealed to investors looking for stable returns. And today, the industry is not only attracting angel and venture capital from generalist funds and family offices, but it's also attracting investments from governments and sovereign wealth funds who are interested in food security. And also, many of the world's wealthiest individuals and celebrities are coming into the space. People like, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Oprah Winfrey, Martha Stewart with the investment in App Harvest. They just see an opportunity here to come in and to transform, and often what they see is a broken system. So two areas in particular that are seeing a lot of interest today. One is about how food is produced. A lot of work on bringing farming from outside in an open environment subject to the weather, and lots of other, unpredictable, uncontrollable vagaries there to inside. And here, we see it in a farm, food being grown on rooftops, in supermarkets, outside in big installations. And clearly, the big installation in Moorhead with App Harvest is in this space. The other area that's seeing a lot of investment today is around the alternative protein space. So how are we going to be producing meat and dairy type of products in the future? A record $2.3 billion of investment came into this in 2020. There's plant-based proteins, there's cultivated meats, we have a new pillar of fermentation-based meats and dairies. And besides being creating a real buzz with consumers, these companies are receiving really strong interest from investors. And again, this is where we see a lot of billionaire and celebrity investments who believe that the food system is unsustainable and needs to be transformed. And also we see investors by, again, governments, particularly out of Asia, where that view food security and the importance of protein um, as very important to their regional security. The largest animal protein and food companies today are also introducing their own plant-based products line: Tyson, Springfield, JBS, Purdue. So this is really, as I look at it, it's almost like a bit of a battle going on right now in terms of how we define sustainable food production. And you might think, oh, gee, these are just going to be small niche products. But if we think about plant-based milks in particular, that's a booming business in the US today. Sales are over $2 billion. That's 14% of all milk sales. And over 40% of US households now purchase plant-based milks, which shows, very widespread adoption. So it's not an all or nothing thing anymore. This issue about, flexitarians, that's maybe our new word in our diet. And so, plant-based products just aren't for, vegetarians anymore. So now, so just, very briefly. So we've had this big, big shock to the system with COVID. So, and what did COVID do? It really just accelerated all these megatrends that were going on from the consumer side. A greater appreciation for the link between diet and health, a lot of questions about the current food system, and also what we saw, and I think kind of shockingly, this was a new one, that's a dramatic rise in local food security, kind of further fracturing demand between, the haves and the have-nots. From the sustainability side, it was really a wake-up call to industry, to governments and consumers about some of the challenges around what is a very efficient food system, but that we need to, in addition, be sustainable, resilient, and more equitable in that. From a technology side, there's been more focus on automation, but also the idea, we all know now that we have to have broadband. Everybody has to have broadband if we're going to work, if we're going to have healthcare, if we're going to have education. And from an investment side of it, really some doubling down on this alternate protein space from the issues of food security. So now kind of switching gears completely, I want to talk just a little bit, very briefly, about this project that kind of kicked off a year ago today in Lexington. The question is that given the growing importance of technology and innovation in the food system, how can Kentucky, kind of join in this transformation, and what kind of role could we play? So, so my group was engaged by this, it's kind of this group centered around Lexington. So it was, University of Kentucky with Dean Cox, it was Mayor Gorton, it was Mark Lyons of Alltech, and Commissioner Quarles. And we were asked to, kind of take a look out there and to develop a strategy for the region, but with a statewide focus on what Kentucky could do to really go ahead. So, one of the things though is that even though we were based in the Lexington area, and that was kind of our focal lens, we looked at this from a statewide impact area. And we did that because we wanted to have the broadest results, that we could, the best outcomes. And we wanted to encourage this focus on, broader systems versus very narrow approaches based on a single type of technology or business model. We wanted to grow the entire economic pie across the value chain and across geographies. And we also wanted to facilitate, the broadest range of partners that we could. And in particular, we kind of came down to thinking about, what kind of objectives should we have for this project? Should it be about creating jobs? Should it be about, getting better talent? And we said, well, if we can actually focus on outcomes that create opportunities and solve Kentucky problems, that actually will achieve these, more specific outcomes that as a secondary effect of it. So we took this very wide lens. So we took that approach and we combined that with an assessment of Kentucky's position in terms of what capabilities exist, what strengths exist, what did the farming system look like, what kind of university system, what kind of businesses were there. Compared that with what other areas have done, looked at the trends and market opportunities, and came up with really 5 areas, but 4 areas that are developing that we think that have really a big impact for technology, but even more broadly from a strategic and not just a technical focus, that technology is an enabler, but from a strategic focus of Kentucky. You can see those on the left side of the screen here. The one on the right, the Kentucky traditions, this incorporates things like bourbon and equine industry, the restaurant industry, which is well developed. These are things that can be leveraged in that space. There's already pretty strong ecosystems there, but these areas to the left, with the 4, we think there's really an opportunity to to build on Kentucky's position and do something in a space that's not done before. Just very briefly, ag for the middle, this is about new economically viable models for mid-scale farming and processing using scale-appropriate technologies, different product mixes and business models, built on Kentucky's large and diverse number of small and mid-scale farms and ag enterprises. And there's really no pre-existing or national leader in this space. So we think there's a real opportunity to have technologies here to kind of focus on technologies, but also, using Kentucky as a model, Kentucky farms as a model that will be interesting to other places. Future-proof meat and dairy, differentiated production based on consumer insight, science, and data-enabled systems to secure animal protein's future. This is very difficult to do at a national level, maybe possible at a state level. Food is health. This is maybe an unusual one. Think about products and offerings that improve key health outcomes for consumers and the overall health in the state. And this is really about, really feathering that connection that, we don't make often enough between, what you eat and, how you feel and wellness and your overall health comes. It's also about creating, bringing more people in under this tent. But the 4th area of focus, sustainable and resilient regional and local food systems, which we describe as tech-enabled, scalable, sustainable, and distributed production. So that's really, kind of where we are today. Just thinking a little bit more about that. Again, we were looking at it from the tech lens in terms of how tech can enable that system, but I think this is a good spot from how we, can think in this conference, it's not just about tech. Tech is just an enabler. It's about what does it take to create this food system, this ecosystem around it. This opportunity builds on the local food movement that's already, under development here, builds on the Kentucky Proud brand, the great work done by the Food Connection at, the mayor's office in Lexington. This very strong, I think, history of innovation in Kentucky, and gives us an opportunity to think about how to kind of move forward on this moment in time to where it seems, resilient is a new word. I think, a year ago, it was one that we weren't talking about as frequently in this space. So some examples of some technologies and applications that might work here, we have indoor ag systems and automation, distributed production processing, diversifying, enabling, different crops and different methods, sustainability improving equipment, traceability systems, online, B2B, business to business, direct to consumer marketplaces. And so this is about, kind of coming back to why we're here today. So if we're moving into this new normal, we've had this time of tremendous change. And again, couldn't have imagined a year ago, how the attention that would have been placed on getting food. Who would have thought a year ago that, shoppers would have gone to the supermarket and be faced with empty shelves, that they would be rushing to, not only to hoard toilet paper, but to figure out, kind of where to buy meat, where to get vegetables delivered, rushing to actually being this huge shift in demand, way you can't go to the restaurant anymore, it might be shut down. Where does this food come from? And then, of course, the impacts of the system that has to, as all of you in your business has had to pivot and define from what might be very traditional markets to these new market opportunities and to make these connections. So, given that we are now talking a lot more about resilience in addition to sustainability and efficiency, what does it actually mean? And if we think about it, to me, there's three elements of resilience. One is that you need a diversity of places products are being produced. So distributed production, maybe more like a fractal approach rather than a straight line system of, just, A goes to B, it goes to C. You need some redundancy in the system. You need some excess supply, because if there's a shock and suddenly demand switches from food service to retail, you need to be able to fill that demand um, while the rest of the market pivots to get there and makes the changes to get there. And the third thing you need, so you need a little extra capacity in the system. So whether that's growing capacity or production capacity, handling infrastructure capacity, that's resilience has those additional things, and in a very efficient system, all of those have been pushed out, and that's where we are today. And so why we found it so difficult in the short term last year to pivot, even though I will say that it's the agri-food industry's done an amazing job about doing that. One way to think of this resiliency, it's analogous, these extra capacity, which can leads to extra cost, to like business disruption insurance. So today, businesses pay for an insurance policy that says, hey, if something happens, if a port gets shut down, if, a product gets stuck, if my supplier can't deliver me something, I'm covered from a financial standpoint from that if my business can't operate. But guess what? That doesn't help the person at the very end of the chain. If you're in the food industry, not being able to deliver that food to consumer, just being rewarded from that doesn't satisfy that end demand. So if we could kind of think about, well, that premium that we're paying today for this business disruption insurance, if we could invest that into a more resilient food system, into this extra capacity, into this extra production, into this, kind of a little bit of excess supply and inventory in the system, wouldn't that be a better outcome than just kind of having a financial transaction here that says, hey, if my business doesn't operate, I get a check in the mail. So that seems like a great idea, but how do we actually get that done? Because what typically happens is in the short term, when you really remember that shock, it's like, great, I'll save for the rainy day because we just had a rainy day and I know I need it. But as you move down the line, it's like, well, gee, that rainy day might not happen again. We might not get that shock again. But yet you build up the system around it. And what typically happens in agriculture, then we end up a situation of excess supply compared to demand. And that typically falls on the farmer then because prices fall, right? Basic law of economics. So how do we avoid that? And kind of thinking about that, brings up a number of questions in my mind. And these are the ones I'm really looking forward to discussing with Lillian and Alita. Particularly how they relate to Kentucky. So the first question in my mind is like, how do we secure this pandemic-related increase in demand for local foods? What are the products, the services, the business models out there that says, well, gee, people are paying, right now, maybe they're buying a lot of locally processed meats if they could. But what happens when, supermarkets are, it's easy to go to the supermarket again. People are buying online. They go back to their jobs and their activities, and they don't have time now to go do that. So how long will they say, gee, I might be willing to pay more for this? And I'm looking forward, later on to hearing some of the conversations about the meat processing projects that are going on in Kentucky and how those have to be related, in addition to building capacity, to building demand. I think there's a question about go-to-market infrastructure. So how can we actually efficiently, and that's a big word, like effectively, maybe is a better word, build infrastructure to get local products to that consumer segment, kind of where are the gaps and who funds this infrastructure. I think what's happening, what Kentucky did with, the school lunches, the school meals, and the local demand, filling that was a model that we can all learn from. So how do we reduce the farm and supply chain risk? This idea about, now that we built, maybe more supply, and we get into this space that demand may be shifting around, and you've got the seasonality piece of it. You've just got the season piece of it. Sometimes good harvest, sometimes bad harvest, which, you know, makes big swings in prices. Are there technology solutions for that? Is it about further processing of value added? Is it about diversifying the customer base? Or are there non-traditional revenue streams that can come into farms that, provide more stability besides just the agricultural products? And then, kind of a big picture question is, how do we measure the value of a strong local food system as a public good? I think we would all say that, having access to local foods, can lead to improved health outcomes. It can lead to a better sense of community. It can lead. We know now that spending time in nature is actually positive from a mental health and a physical health standpoint. How can we think about these things and actually take those things into account along with the traditional market mechanisms that we look at from the investment standpoint? So, if I had to, just say, a couple of things, three things, takeaways in terms of, what I think, what I, recommend for Kentucky, and particularly for local food systems in Kentucky. The first one is a lesson that I've heard from, I wrote a case study on Yum brands in China, so the parent of KFC and Pizza Hut. And there in China, Yum is by far the most successful, quick casual restaurant chains, more developed than McDonald's years ago. And they have a really interesting CEO there by the name of Sam Su. And Sam taught me about something called what he's described as future back thinking. And the reason that Yum took a very different approach in China, back when the country was just opening up, they thought about, wow, if this were fully operational, where would we want to have? What would we want our restaurant system to look like and the infrastructure to serve those restaurants? And then they built it well before demand was there. So, Sam's lesson would be to say, envision the food system you want, and then build the infrastructure, the supply chains, and the capabilities to achieve it. The second thing I would encourage is that we should adopt a mindset of co-opetition. Well, what is co-opetition? Co-opetition is when competitors cooperate on some things and compete on others. So maybe everybody, maybe there's an umbrella marketing brand that everybody uses, but yet under that brand you compete, a bit like Kentucky Proud. And a story that I have to tell you here is from Ireland, which is country, kind of in some ways similar to Kentucky, kind of small, very green, lots of horses and also, great spirits industry. But I've been working with the country for about 10 years. And when I started, the agricultural industry there was actually in a really bad shape. They had small farms, the costs were high. They produced a lot of beef and dairy that were shipped out as, basic commodities. And because costs were high, they were not doing very well. And they brought their entire agri-food sector together under a national sustainability program called Origin Green. And this spanned the supply chain farms, through processors, all the way to leading to differentiated output. The government was behind it. The policies and the incentives were lined up around it. Big companies and big farms supported small ones because you couldn't afford to have a bad actor on it. And this program was introduced in 2012 after 2 years of putting it together. And by 2016, 96% of Ireland's food and drink outputs were sold, or came from Origin Green supply chain. And I just think this shows the power of what can be achieved. And that led to new markets, it led to higher prices, and it's led to a real upskilling of the farming industry in Ireland. It just shows this real power that can be achieved if you have a kind of a shared vision that's communicated well, and everybody works together. And the thing that I always say in groups like this, the biggest opportunity, the biggest need is leadership. I mean, it's about, we all have, maybe a lot of great ideas, but who actually steps up to the plate and, really takes those bold steps and, shares that vision and, leads the way so others can come on and get behind. So, leadership and then the talent to support that. They're really the biggest opportunities and constraints in any kind of system when we think about what we want to do. If we focus on educating and growing those leaders, I think the rest of it is just naturally comes behind that. So I know that that's a lot of information in a really short period of time. I thank you for your patience. I'm looking forward to talking about these issues now with my very well-grounded and esteemed new friends from Kentucky over the last year, Lillian and Alita.
Thanks so much, Ray. Thanks for a fascinating presentation. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. Thanks to folks who find it, and we can weave those into our conversation. I'll invite Alita to say hello and introduce herself. Y'all have already heard from me, but this is now we're transitioning to the fireside chat, as Mary named it. So Alita, hello, welcome.
Hi, I won't spend much time. Alita Botts, Executive Director at Kentucky Center for Ag and Rural Development, and many of y'all know me, but looking forward to the chat.
Great. And we did have some questions about, can we have the slides later recording? So we are recording today's proceedings. You'll be able to view the sessions later. And we'll have a copy of the summary report that Mary prepared for the county, the city. So we'll have those resources available later. And in the Q&A, we've got some questions from Will Snell about really this question of agriculture of the middle. So this is a phrase that at least rural sociologists have used for a few decades. Fresh Kirschenen's work out of Iowa, looking at the Goldilocks zone between small farms that do well in niche direct markets, large enterprises that operate on global commodity scales, and the squeezing out of mid-sized farmers who can't compete effectively in these very race to the bottom commodity markets, but are perhaps too big for the farmers markets to be enough, or based on Will's question, challenges around resources to adopt technology and sustainability driven local food systems. And pointing out to this greater concentration, that trend can lead towards concentration. And so maybe that's a place to start our conversation, Mary, of how can we find that intersection of ag of the middle, mid-sized farmers that have traditionally been the bread and butter of American agricultural economies, and these emerging local and regional food systems. And Alita, you too. I have thoughts, but I just asked the question, so I'll circle back.
Well, just, kind of kicking it off from that idea about, tech. And I think, technology, when we think traditionally, how it's worked in food. So we get more technology, and that tech gets developed to one right now. It's being developed, for big opportunities, big market opportunities, and those are, typically ones that are the bigger size farms. So we don't see a lot of tech kind of thinking specifically for, gee, what are these needs of these small size farms? But a lot of that tech is also based on increasing productivity, right? And when you increase productivity, you get into this naturally vicious cycle of, gee, now I'm more productive, so and maybe it's easier to farm, so now I need more land, and so the margins go down, and it's just, it's almost like a race to the bottom, right? So it's, Will's right, you either have to get big or, get out. And I just see now, with this tech that's coming online, it's actually, scale neutral. It can break some of these economies of scale. You don't have to be big to, to put, to adopt some of these, data-driven systems. Some of it is getting to where the costs are actually not small. You think about, more of a distributed processing approach. Think about 3D printing in the manufacturing sector, right? So you can do today what you needed a big plant to do. Now you can do it in a small way. And, so I think, tech can play a tremendous role here if we can get that tech developed in a right way. And, and I think the other thing that tech then gives us the ability to have more diversified enterprises, because now we're able to manage that on a smaller scale and deal with the complexity that comes with a more diversified enterprise. At the same time, when we know labor is, can be a tremendous burden. But I'm interested in what Alita thinks about that from her point of view.
Well, thanks. A few things, with regard to Dr. Snell's question. I mean, I think if you look at Kentucky, we already have a pretty high percentage of farmers in Kentucky that do have off-farm income and are dependent on that off-farm income. We do have quite a bit of that in the state because, of course, we have a base of small and medium-sized farms. And so, I think a lot of farmers have already diversified into areas where they think they can do both work the off-farm job and also be active farmers. They've navigated a lot of that over the past 20 years. And so this is, is it still happening? Absolutely. And they'll continue to. I think what we saw this past year, though, is that because the cost of some technologies has gone down, that enabled farmers who were serving the local food system to bring down their per unit cost in a way that we've not seen before. So the technology for those farmers to actually reach consumers, because we did have more online sales, because we do have easier ways to set up online shopping carts, we do have easier ways to coordinate deliveries, we have easier ways to track inventory and track product. And you mentioned that a lot of these sustainability-minded companies are looking for these pieces. And I guess, the technology question is a challenging one because it means 50 million things, right? And so I think if you look at some of the technology that we've all sort of incorporated into our lives, and we see how it was used in the past year by farmers to bring down their per unit cost to serve those local food systems, to me, that's very promising. I think we can see more of that used by small and medium-sized farmers to, again, bring down some of their operating costs. So they're competing in a different way than they've been able to compete before. But it won't be easy. We can't paint a Pollyanna picture of it. There's a cost to the new technology. There's a cost of adopting it. And so it's still a major challenge for farmers.
I think I come at this always, I really love having conversations with Alita and Mary because we have such distinct points of view on this. And I want to, part of my answer to this question would circle back to what Mary was posing about how do we think of, or do we think of our food system as a public good? And if there's something that the past year has highlighted, it's that efficiency isn't necessarily the best way to achieve resilience or vitality, and that there are real vulnerabilities that come with having all of our eggs in one basket, if you'll forgive the ag pun or a metaphor. So in ag of the middle spaces, what's pre-COVID strategies that work, like the Ireland model that Mary messages or references, what we call values-based value chains. And the classic example of this would be the shepherd's grain and flour model out of Washington and that area, where this sort of cooperation place where the value of having diversified farm systems or a robust rural farm economy, which we know is good for rural economies writ large, helps them come together, negotiate win-win relationships with everyone down that value chain and create stability. So can we think about that for our food system as a whole? And where does public investment in the form of the types of infrastructure that Mary was gesturing towards, and we have a lot of that. We are very fortunate in Kentucky, and we take it for granted often by having a fairly robust livestock processing mid-tier infrastructure, meaning we have a range of livestock processing in the state. We still have grain processing in the state. We have robust farmers markets and produce So we have these things, and how do we think collectively about how we want to think proactively about creating resilience, so when the next disruption comes, not if, we are ready to invest those resources, have a place for that food to land that supports the vitality of our community writ large. So again, tying it, because all of those themes that Mary pointed to, I think are important in this space. So if we're thinking about food as health, what are the dimensions of health that we're looking at there? Economic health, for sure. Having a robust food economy is good for rural economies, is good for the state generally. Physical health also, which we know is a great cost to our communities. So having access to healthful foods for all people. Social health, right? That we have a vibrant, well-connected culture, that we have good governance where we're talking to each other, and also ecological health. And so if we think about the holistic approach to food systems, which local and regional food systems do, and recognize that we need to think intentionally about where and how we make investments together, we create spaces, we create a diverse economic system that has, there's no one right scale, right? We don't all want to be the Costco's of the world, neither do we all want to be the corner bodega. So how do we promote that sort of diversity as its own form of resilience? And I'll pass it back to Mary to ask her questions.
Right. I was going to, that was such great. So again, I love having conversations all the way here, Lillian, that way to think about food as health. I never thought about those 4 dimensions of it because I was just always thinking about physical health, but maybe, it's just such a interesting approach, right? To also include, and we think about sustainability, right? It's the idea about the economic health, it's the social health, but the ecological health. But I think the, getting down, with sustainability and incorporating physical health with it is a movement we see in the world, and it's kind of, but it's challenging, right? Because we're crossing silos now. So everybody, kind of the health industry has its silo, the, ag and food industry, typically has their silo, but, the cost of, kind of food related, illnesses in the US dominates actually the cost of the food industry. And so how do we get the engagement there and get those dollars in and say, wait, if we could actually invest it in the food system rather than in treatment or even in things to do for prevention, but let's, how can we get these conversations under a tent? And and I think that's so much a part of resilience. Where do you think, have there been any, over the past year, any kind of movements on that space? And I guess, kind of 2 pieces of the question as I think about this, because I think about, how can we secure this, pandemic related increase in demand for local foods, increase in interest for local foods, increase in demand for local foods, to where we can keep that there. Lita, talked about that some things now we've, learned that, figured out how the cost to serve more economically, which is really important. But I think some of it is like, it's the cost to serve, but it's also the, it's either so much easier to go to the supermarket now that my life is very busy again, or it's so much easier just to like click online and have a product delivered to my doorstep. And, so how do we keep this interest alive and going?
One of the pieces I think about is consumers are fickle, right? And I don't, but institutions are anchors. And if we're going to build, I wouldn't say redundancy, but diversity and resilience into our regional food system intentionally with that public good approach, we've been working hard at UK to build our local procurement programs. And we know that farm to school efforts with K through 12 programs can be an incredible economic driver for farm impact products, right? Food grown by community members for children in their community. And that also is that path towards lifelong health and economic health. And so one of the ways that we could move collectively in the space of governance is looking at how we as a state and a region are going to support our public institutions, but also private institutions in having that sustained long-term demand that is the sort of investment that builds infrastructure, that builds a food system, so that when disruptions come, there is that built-in supply chain and value chain. I'm curious to hear what Alita says.
So I guess what I would say is that while you're absolutely right that consumers are fickle, I would also say institutions can be pretty fickle too. And I think one reason that you had different impacts in Kentucky than you had in other states with COVID of last year is because we have not had as many producers dependent on wholesale accounts from institutions. So when those institutional accounts dried up last year, you saw different impacts in Kentucky than you did in many other states. Now, I think you're absolutely right that institutions can create that long-term growth, but I also think we've got to be careful because we've seen any number of producers burned by institutional fickleness, for lack of a better word. And so, I think we have to look at a bigger way to pool that risk, to mitigate that risk. And one thing I wanted to mention, going back to something you all mentioned earlier, that I just want to pipe in here, the value that we saw in the local food system last year during the height of COVID and the height of local food awareness, when people were looking for product that they couldn't find in traditional outlets, that was value created by farmers over the past 20 years. That was value they created for our local and regional communities and economics. And so I think there has to be a recognition that that is economic development that benefited both those producers, the rural communities, those consumers, and the state's economy as a whole. And because of that, that's what led to that resilience. That's what led to the ability to handle that change in demand. But that was due to investments made by producers over the past 20 years and last year especially. And so I think there has to be, you all mentioned investment and where we put our investment dollars. I think some of that is because Kentucky has invested in certain pieces of infrastructure that enabled the system to shift a bit as the ground shifted. It's kind of like, building on an earthquake fault. You've got to build in some flexibility in the system, because if it's too rigid, it's going to fall apart. I think what we want to see in Kentucky is that kind of system that enables us to have that resilience, but also enables us to keep some of those dollars locally, because frankly, our economy needs it.
So I have Alita, a question about something you said. You said, consumers are fickle, but institutions can be fickle as well. And so, and that, some producers have been burned in the past. Do you think there's an opportunity? And I'm like, my guess is that burn has been either because of, now I can do it cheaper someplace else, there's a cheaper source. So, is that mind changing simply based on the economics of it? And is there an opportunity to expand the conversation to say, hey, this is valuable, not just because of this, the direct dollars you're spending, but the other benefits that come in? Or are there other elements of that fickleness that we need to address beyond just thinking that, hey, markets will solve this?
I think it's a fair question. I definitely think you see an impact in institutions from many of the things that Lillian mentioned with regards to their interest in investing more into that infrastructure, investing more into bringing that product in. I think you definitely see those positives. It is a question of economics, certainly, because they do have the ability to source product at a lower per unit cost many times than what they could do. But it's also a question of breaking a system that they've had in place that has incentives built into it that allows it to continue to be in place. And I think the reason that we do want to consider that and we want it to be part of the question is because that's tough work for those incentives to, and I know Lillian and Ashton and many others are working on that, but that's really hard work because those incentives have been built over time. They're based on business relationships that have been built over time, and they take a while to change. And I think especially if the constituents of the institution, and that can be, there's lots of different institutions. We're talking healthcare, we're talking schools, we're talking lots of different. If the constituents are not demanding it, then the institution itself doesn't feel the fire in its belly to make some of those necessary changes.
We have 1 minute left in our time together. If you have any last burning questions or you want to continue the conversation in the chat, I encourage you. At 9, we'll take a 10-minute break. And because I have the mic, I'm going to say one more thing. As we think about and moving into the rest of the sessions today, we've talked a lot about pivots, adaptations, innovations, resilience. How do we make these investments and conversations? And I don't want to lose sight of the fact that in many ways, the ability to be resilient, as Alita mentioned, we fall back on long-term investments and resources that we've put in place, which then also raises a question of equity, access, and justice moving forward, of who are we at risk of leaving behind when we're thinking about pivots, adaptations, innovations moving forward. So when we're making these investments in resources, to be mindful of not falling into virtuous cycles where success goes to the successful and those who have been historically underserved continue to be underserved, and to center those questions in how we think about bringing everyone to the table to bring economic vitality, health vitality, cultural and social vitality to everyone in our community, rural communities, urban communities, racial and ethnic equity, economic equity, so that we all have access to those foods. And I think we'll see that carry out through our conversation today. Great. Okay. I think we're good. Let's give we can all virtually clap our hands and thank Mary for her thoughtful comments. Thank you to Alita for such a robust conversation. I wish we could do it all day. We will take a 10-minute break. We will reconvene at 10:10 for our first panel, looking at pandemic pivots on the farm. And I will invite Grace to share a panelist speaker, and we'll see you all in 10 minutes.